It's Miss Laura. I'm going to read to you one of my favorite books, or just one of the stories out of this book, actually. It's Frog and Toad Together. Frog and Toad are friends. And today we're going to read a little bit about dragons and giants. Frog and Toad were reading a book together. The people in this book are brave, said Toad. They fight dragons and giants, and they are never afraid. I wonder if we are brave, said Frog. Frog and Toad looked into a mirror. We look brave, said Frog. Yes, but are we? Asked Toad. Frog and Toad went outside. We can try to climb this mountain, said Frog. That should tell us if we are brave. Frog went leaping over the rocks, and Toad came puffing up behind him. They came to a dark cave. A big snake came out of the cave. Hello, lunch, said the snake when he saw Frog and Toad. He opened his wide mouth. Frog and Toad jumped away. Toad was shaking. I am not afraid, he cried. They climbed higher, and then they heard a loud noise. Many large stones were rolling down the mountain. It's an avalanche, cried Toad. Frog and Toad jumped away. Frog was trembling. I am not afraid, he shouted. They came to the top of a mountain. The shadow of a hawk fell over them. Frog and Toad jumped under a rock. The hawk flew away. We are not afraid, screamed Frog and Toad at the same time. Then they ran down the mountain very fast. They ran past the place where they saw the avalanche. They ran past the place where they saw the snake. They ran all the way to Toad's house. Oh, Frog, I am glad to have a brave friend like you, said Toad. He jumped into the bed and pulled the cover over his head. And I am happy to know a brave person like you, Toad, said Frog. He jumped into the closet and shut the door. Toad stayed in the bed, and Frog stayed in the closet, and they stayed there for a long time, just feeling very brave together. The end. Frog and Toad really want to be brave together, so they go out looking for danger, and of course they find it. But they endure it together, and they run home together, and they experience their fear together. And to me, I really connect this story to something that happens in the Bible right around Easter. So last Sunday was Easter, and of course we're celebrating on Easter that Jesus was put to death, died, and then 3 days later on Easter morning rose again. So he went from being dead to being back alive, which is a miracle, right? And what's really interesting in our Bible story about the resurrection is that it happens, and the disciples, Jesus' followers, men and women, learn about Jesus' resurrection, and they are afraid. They are terrified. And also they don't really believe that it's happening. In fact, it's kind of funny, actually. There are 4 different versions of Jesus' life story in the Bible. We get one version from Matthew, one version from Mark, one version from Luke, and one version from John. Those 4 books of the Bible are called the Gospels, and they're each trying to tell Jesus' life story, but none of them were actually written during the time Jesus was alive. So they're all a little bit different, and it's kind of interesting. There are ways that the stories are the same, and then there's a lot of ways that the stories are different. What's really neat is to look at the same story in each one of the different Gospels and see how they're different and see the ways in which they are the same. In the story of Jesus' resurrection, for example, there are lots and lots of interesting differences. So, for example, in the book of Matthew, there are 2 women who go to Jesus' tomb. They get there, right? This is 3 days after he's been dead. They get there, there are guards guarding the tomb, and all of a sudden there's an earthquake, okay? Everybody's knocked to the ground. They're really scared. And then an angel appears, and the angel is so terrifying that the guards actually pass out. And it says in the Bible that it was as if they were dead. So like this angel knocks them to the ground. The women must have been really terrified, but they stay on their feet. but they run away. And Jesus stops them in the road and explains who he is, and they fall down worshiping him. But what's really important to notice in that story in Matthew is how much fear these women have. And then in Mark, what's interesting is there are 3 women who go to the tomb. Mary, her friend Mary, and then their friend Salome. So the 3 of them go to the tomb. There are no guards in this version, and there's 1 angel. And when the women run back to the male disciples, to all of their friends who are boys, none of the boys believed them, which I think must have been very frustrating. Then in the Gospel of Luke, which is our 3rd version of Jesus' life story, there are 2 women who go, but this time it's Mary and Joanna. They also find an empty tomb, but in this version there are 2 angels. But again, just like Frog and Toad, they are absolutely terrified and run. They run away. Jesus appears and disappears to the disciples, and it's all very kind of frightening to them. And then in the last version of Jesus' life, the Gospel of John, we get even another version. In this version, Mary, one of the Marys, goes alone to Jesus' tomb. And she has an encounter with Jesus, but again, is very afraid. And yet, despite the fact that these women are full of fear, Jesus tells them to do one important thing. Go and tell my friends. Go and tell my other disciples. So the women, the female disciples, run and tell the male disciples. In some versions of the story, the men don't believe them, and in other versions, the men do believe that, but they're afraid as well. But despite being afraid, just like in Frog and Toad, the disciples come together. They have their moment of fear together, and they wait together until Jesus is going to come to them in person again. And that is going to be something that they experience, and I'm going to talk to you more about that next week. While you're thinking about this experience of resurrection, Jesus's new life, and the disciples who experienced it, I'm going to read to you something out of this really great devotional book. It's called Anytime Devotions. It kind of goes with the Action Bible, which is an illustrated Bible that's really, really great for kids. And this devotional is all about hope. And it's going to kind of talk a little bit about the experiences of the women who saw the resurrection. So it says, when hope seems lost. Have you ever had a day that seemed entirely hopeless? Maybe you fought with your friends and didn't know if you would ever fix it, or your parents said they don't have enough money to buy groceries, or you couldn't explain why, but you felt so sad that you just didn't care about anything? That is how the women felt the day they went to the tomb. Back when Jesus lived, women weren't always treated fairly, but God created both men and women in his image. The very first people to hear about Jesus rising from the dead were women. They had gone to Jesus' tomb after he died to care for his body. Imagine their shock and their fear when instead of seeing Jesus, they met bright, shining men who told them that Jesus had risen from the dead. Jesus told his disciples many times he had to die and that he would rise again 3 days later, but no one quite understood it until it happened. The women, when they heard from the angels, suddenly remembered Jesus' words. The Messiah they thought had died was actually alive and well. God had done something amazing that was about to change the world. This gift brought the disciples new hope. So here's a little prayer that I'd like for us to pray together. So if you can, make the sign of the cross, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Dear God, thank you so much for hope. I have hope. Hope for my life and hope for each day. Help me to share your promise with others and to use hope to overcome my fears. Amen.